My mom and dad took my golden sibling's side in all his accusations, so I simply stopped arguing and cut them off. My name is Ryan, and I'm 29 years old. I work as an environmental compliance officer here in Hartford, Connecticut. It's not the most glamorous job you could imagine, but it's honest work that I take pride in. My role involves making sure companies follow environmental regulations properly, keeping people safe while protecting the environment we all share. It's the kind of steady, responsible work that fits who I am as a person. I've been living in this city for most of my life, building my career step by step through dedication and persistence. I've always tried to stay away from unnecessary drama and keep my world relatively simple and straightforward. At least, that's how things work outside of my family situation. When it comes to my family, simple has never been an option. Growing up, it was always just me and my younger brother, Tyler. He's 26 now, 3 years younger than me, but the gap between us has always felt much larger than those few years would suggest. From the very beginning, our parents saw him as the charming one, funny, full of infectious energy, and always knowing exactly how to light up any room he walked into. He had this natural charisma that drew people in and made them want to believe in him. Meanwhile, I was cast as the responsible one in the family dynamic. I was the quiet kid who didn't make waves, who followed the rules, and who could be counted on to handle whatever needed handling. While Tyler was getting praised for his personality and potential, I was expected to be the steady, reliable foundation that everyone else could lean on when things got difficult. This fundamental difference in how we were perceived and treated translated into countless unfair moments over the years. But there's one particular incident that really stuck with me, something that happened back when we were in high school that perfectly encapsulated the twisted family dynamics that would plague us for years to come. Tyler had taken my car without asking one night. This wasn't unusual. He had a habit of helping himself to things that belonged to other people when it suited his needs. But this time, he decided to drive it while he was drunk, which was a decision that ended about as well as you'd expect. He crashed my car into a fire hydrant and then careened into a parked SUV, causing significant damage to both vehicles and leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The police called our house that night to inform my parents about the accident and Tyler's arrest. I remember lying in bed, listening to the muffled conversations downstairs, thinking that surely this would be the wake-up call my parents needed to see who Tyler really was and what he was capable of when left to his own devices. But somehow, when the morning came, I found myself grounded instead of Tyler. My parents' reasoning was that I hadn't been responsible enough to keep an eye on my little brother. According to them, I should have known better than to leave my keys where Tyler could access them. I should have anticipated his poor decision-making and prevented the entire situation from happening in the first place. The fact that Tyler had stolen my car, driven drunk, and caused thousands of dollars in damage was somehow secondary to my failure to protect him from his own choices. That pattern of twisted logic and misplaced blame never really changed as we got older. It just evolved and found new ways to manifest itself in our family relationships. Tyler would consistently get into trouble throughout his teenage years and early adulthood. School fights that he somehow never started, part-time jobs that he'd lose due to misunderstandings with management, and mysterious instances of missing cash from around the house that no one could quite explain. Each time something went wrong in Tyler's life, our parents would bend over backwards to find some external reason why it wasn't actually his fault. "He's just misunderstood," they'd say with conviction, as if Tyler was some complex artistic soul whose true nature was being overlooked by an unfair world. "He's got so much potential, he just needs the right opportunity to really shine and show everyone what he's capable of." They treated each failure as a temporary setback rather than part of a concerning pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, I was quietly going about the business of building a real life for myself. I graduated from high school without any drama, found stable work in my field, and approached my finances with the kind of careful planning that would serve me well in the long run. I saved money consistently and methodically, eventually putting together enough for a down payment on a modest condo. Throughout this entire process, I received exactly zero help from my parents. Not financial assistance, not advice, not even acknowledgement that I was doing things the right way. Tyler, on the other hand, jumped from one failed startup idea to another with the enthusiasm of someone who had never faced real consequences for failure. He tried his hand at cryptocurrency trading during one of the big market bubbles, convinced he had cracked some secret code that would make him rich overnight. When that inevitably crashed and burned, He moved on to affiliate marketing, spending months building websites and social media profiles that generated essentially no income. After the affiliate marketing dream died, he pivoted to some kind of life coaching business. Despite having no credentials, no training, and no life experience that would qualify him to guide others. Each of these ventures was enthusiastically bankrolled by our parents, who saw every new scheme as evidence that Tyler was finally finding his path in life. None of it stuck, and none of it paid off in any meaningful way. But that didn't stop the pattern from continuing, and it certainly didn't stop my parents from funding the next big idea that Tyler would present to them, with his characteristic charm and confidence. I kept telling them to stop enabling this behavior. I warned them clearly and repeatedly that Tyler didn't know how to handle money responsibly, and more importantly, that he wasn't just careless with finances, he was actively manipulative. I could see the pattern even if they couldn't. Tyler would create a mess through his own poor choices, then play the victim when the consequences started piling up, and somehow still manage to walk away with sympathy and more money in his pocket to fund the next disaster. Every single time I tried to raise these red flags with my parents, I'd get the same dismissive responses. "He's just trying to find his path in life," they'd say, as if being in your mid-20s was some kind of extended adolescence that excused any amount of irresponsible behavior. "Don't be so hard on him," they'd add, making me feel like the unreasonable one for pointing out obvious problems and patterns that were right in front of everyone's faces. The most frustrating part was watching them treat Tyler's repeated failures as noble attempts while simultaneously taking my actual success for granted. Tyler's unsuccessful ventures were viewed as evidence of his entrepreneurial spirit and creativity, while my steady career and financial responsibility were simply expected and unremarkable. Then, a couple of years ago, our father had a significant health scare. It wasn't life-threatening, thankfully, but it was serious enough to require multiple hospital visits, ongoing medical monitoring, and a complex web of healthcare bureaucracy that needed constant attention. Someone had to handle the insurance calls, sort through the mounting medical bills, manage pharmacy pickups, and coordinate between different specialists who all seemed to operate on completely different schedules. I immediately put my own life on hold to manage this crisis. I took unpaid time off from work, something that wasn't easy given my responsibilities and the projects I was overseeing. I became the family's unofficial medical coordinator, making all the necessary phone calls to insurance companies and spending hours navigating their automated systems and bureaucratic red tape. I scheduled appointments, kept track of test results, and made sure our father was getting to every follow-up visit on time. I dealt with the insurance complications that seemed to multiply daily, prior authorizations that expired without notice, claims that were mysteriously denied for procedures that should have been covered, and billing departments that couldn't seem to communicate with each other even within the same hospital system. It was exhausting, time-consuming work that required constant vigilance and follow-through. Tyler's contribution to this family medical crisis was showing up once at the hospital with a Dunkin' Donuts coffee in hand. He stayed for maybe 20 minutes, took a cheerful selfie with our father for his Instagram account, and then disappeared back to whatever he was doing with his time. That single visit was apparently enough to establish him as a devoted son in the eyes of our parents and their social circle. The most infuriating part was how this narrative got spun in the weeks and months that followed. When people asked our parents about how they were managing during this difficult time, they would consistently say things like, "Tyler's been such a great support through all of this." They would go on and on about how wonderful it was to have Tyler checking in and being there for the family during a challenging period. Meanwhile, I was never mentioned in these conversations. Not once. Despite the fact that I had sacrificed weeks of my own time, potentially damaged my standing at work, and handled virtually every practical aspect of our father's medical care, I somehow didn't factor into the story of who had been supportive during this crisis. It was as if all of my actual tangible contributions were invisible, while Tyler's single coffee delivery visit had transformed him into the hero of the situation. A few months after our father's health had stabilized and the medical crisis had passed, Tyler approached me with what he claimed was his latest and greatest business opportunity. He wanted to open a sports bar, and he had it all figured out, or so he said. He claimed he had found the perfect location, had a buddy who was experienced in restaurant management and would handle the day-to-day operations, and had worked out all the financial projections that showed this would be a guaranteed success. The only thing he needed, he explained, was for me to co-sign a loan. Just one signature on the paperwork, and he'd be able to make his sports bar dream a reality. He presented this as if it was a minor favor, something that wouldn't really affect me but would change his entire life trajectory for the better. I told him no without hesitation. The answer was an immediate, unequivocal no. I had watched Tyler's pattern of behavior for years, and I wasn't about to put my own financial stability and credit rating at risk for what was obviously going to be another failed venture that would end with him walking away and leaving someone else to deal with the consequences. Tyler's reaction to my refusal was explosive. He called me selfish, bitter, and jealous. According to him, I was deliberately sabotaging his success because I couldn't stand to see him finally achieve something meaningful. He accused me of holding grudges from our childhood and using this opportunity to get revenge for imagined slights from years past. Even our parents stepped into this conflict, taking Tyler's side as they always did. They said he just needed one real shot, one genuine opportunity to prove himself and show everyone what he was capable of achieving. They made it sound like my refusal to co-sign was the only thing standing between Tyler and the successful future he deserved. When I continued to refuse, they made the decision to co-sign the loan themselves. They put their own financial security on the line for Tyler's sports bar venture, despite having just come through a medical crisis that had already strained their resources, and despite having watched Tyler fail at every previous business attempt he'd made. That decision to co-sign Tyler's loan themselves marked a turning point for me. It was when I started pulling back from the family dynamic that had consumed so much of my energy and emotional bandwidth for years. I didn't go completely no contact at that point, but I made a deliberate choice to stop offering help, advice, or solutions to problems that weren't mine to solve. I continued to show up for the obligatory family events, birthdays, holidays, and other gatherings where my absence would have been noted and criticized. But my participation became minimal and strategic. I would arrive with a bottle of wine or a generic gift card, make polite conversation for the minimum socially acceptable amount of time, and then leave early with some excuse about work or other commitments. More importantly, I stopped giving advice and stopped arguing with their decisions. When conversations turned to Tyler's latest schemes or problems, I would simply nod politely and let the words pass through me without engaging. I had spent years trying to warn them, trying to show them the patterns I could see so clearly, and it had accomplished nothing except making me the target of their frustration and defensiveness. I figured if they were going to make their choices regardless of my input, then they could live with the consequences of those choices without expecting me to clean up the aftermath. It wasn't my responsibility to save people who didn't want to be saved, especially when they consistently ignored every warning I tried to give them. This period of relative peace and distance lasted for several months. I focused on my own life, my work, and my personal relationships outside the family drama. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without constantly worrying about what crisis Tyler would create next or how I would be expected to help resolve it. Then came the funeral that changed everything once again. A distant cousin had passed away, someone I hadn't seen in years, but respected enough to attend the service out of basic human decency. I showed up quietly, dressed appropriately, and stood in the back of the room keeping to myself throughout the ceremony. I offered my condolences to the immediate family members and planned to leave without drawing any attention to myself. But after the service ended, something completely unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, I found myself cornered by 3 different relatives, people I barely spoke to under normal circumstances. They approached me with accusatory expressions and started asking pointed questions about why I had refused to support the family anymore. They wanted to know why I had become so distant and cold toward everyone, why I seemed to have abandoned my responsibilities as a family member. As the conversation continued, the picture became clearer and more infuriating. It turned out that Tyler had been telling everyone a completely fabricated version of recent events. According to his story, I had refused to help during our father's health issues. He claimed that I had abandoned the family during their time of need, that I had cut everyone off without explanation, and that I was holding some kind of inexplicable grudge that was tearing the family apart. I tried to explain what had actually happened. I attempted to set the record straight about who had actually handled our father's medical care, who had made the appointments and dealt with the insurance companies, and who had sacrificed time and money to make sure everything was taken care of properly. But it was too late. Tyler's version of events had already taken root in people's minds, and my attempts at clarification sounded like excuses or defensive backtracking. The damage was done. Tyler had successfully rewritten history to cast himself as the devoted son and me as the abandoning brother who had turned his back on the family during a crisis. Once again, our parents took his side in this conflict, either because they believed his version of events or because it was easier than acknowledging the truth about who had actually stepped up when help was needed. I didn't argue with them. I didn't waste my energy trying to convince people who had already made up their minds based on lies and manipulation. Instead, I simply left the funeral and drove home, knowing that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with these people. That night, I made a decision that I should have made years earlier. I took every family group chat off mute and quietly archived all the conversations. I made the choice to speak to my family members only if it was strictly necessary for legal or emergency purposes. The days of trying to maintain relationships with people who consistently chose Tyler's lies over my truth were officially over. A full year passed in this state of deliberate distance. I kept my focus firmly planted on my own life, my work responsibilities, my friendships, and building an existence that didn't revolve around managing other people's poor decisions. For the first time in years, I felt like I could make plans and pursue goals without constantly wondering what family crisis would derail everything next. During this period, I kept up with my genuine relationships and lived my life according to my own priorities and values. It was liberating to discover how much mental energy I had been wasting on problems that were never mine to solve in the first place. Without the constant drain of family drama, I found myself more productive at work, more present in my friendships, and generally more content with my day-to-day existence. Meanwhile, Tyler's sports bar venture was following the predictable trajectory that I had foreseen from the beginning. After some initial buzz and excitement when it first opened, the business started spiraling downward rapidly. Customer reviews began turning negative, citing poor service, inconsistent food quality, and an overall lack of professional management. Money started going missing from the registers and accounts, though no one seemed able to explain where it was disappearing to or who might be responsible. The experienced buddy, who was supposed to handle the day-to-day operations, either proved to be incompetent or simply walked away when things got difficult. Tyler, who had presented himself as having everything figured out, clearly had no real plan for running a successful restaurant business. Within months, it became obvious that the sports bar was heading toward complete failure. And then, just like that, Tyler disappeared entirely. The bar closed its doors permanently, and whatever money had been invested in the venture was simply gone. This included not just the initial loan that my parents had co-signed, but also a significant chunk of what they had been carefully saving for their retirement. Years of careful financial planning and security had evaporated along with Tyler's latest failed dream. No one could reach Tyler after the bar's collapse. His phone number was disconnected, his apartment was cleaned out, and he had vanished without leaving any forwarding information or explanation. He hadn't bothered to inform anyone of his plans or whereabouts. Not the creditors who were looking for payment, not the business partners who had trusted him, and certainly not the parents who had risked their financial future to support his ambitions. Now, after a year of near-total silence between us, my family had started reaching out to me again. They were calling and leaving voicemails with increasing frequency, reaching out through old family friends who still had my contact information, and generally making it clear that they desperately wanted to re-establish communication. The tone of these attempts was completely different from anything I had experienced before. They weren't angry anymore, which was a stark change from their previous attitude. They weren't defending Tyler's actions or making excuses for his behavior. Instead, they were begging me to talk to them, to help them figure out what to do next. For the first time in years, they weren't taking Tyler's side or protecting him from criticism. They just wanted to know what to do about the mess he had left behind. And they were hoping, maybe even praying, that I would be the one to step in and fix what Tyler had broken, just like I had done so many times before throughout our lives. The specific moment that really drove home how dramatically things had changed came a few weeks after that last cousin's funeral. My phone buzzed past midnight, which immediately set off alarm bells since normal people don't call at that hour unless something serious has happened. When I checked the screen, I saw it was a voicemail from my mother. When I finally listened to the message, her voice sounded completely strained and shaky, like she had been crying for hours before working up the courage to make the call. The emotional exhaustion was evident in every word she spoke. She asked me to please call her back, but she didn't provide any details about what was wrong or why she needed to talk. Just a simple, desperate plea for me to please call back when I had a chance. I didn't return the call immediately. After years of being taken for granted and having my warnings ignored, I wasn't about to jump back into crisis management mode just because they had finally reached the point where they needed help. I let the voicemail sit there while I went about my normal morning routine the next day. The next morning, my phone rang again, and this time it was my father's number showing up on the screen. I ignored the first call, then the second one when it came through a few minutes later. But the third call came before I had even finished making my morning coffee, and the persistence finally convinced me to pick up and see what was so urgent that it couldn't wait for a reasonable hour. My father didn't waste any time with pleasantries or small talk when I finally answered the phone. He got straight to the point and told me that Tyler was gone. Not just missing for a few days like we might have assumed, but really and truly gone. His phone number had been completely disconnected. His apartment had been cleaned out with no forwarding address, and he had left without any kind of word, note, or explanation to anyone. The sports bar had been sold off, apparently for pennies on the dollar compared to what had originally been invested in it. Whatever was left of my parents' retirement savings had vanished along with the failed business venture. But then came the part of the conversation that made everything click into place and revealed the true scope of what Tyler had managed to accomplish. During the bar's early months, when things had seemed to be going well and my parents thought Tyler was finally turning his life around, they had made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. They gave Tyler temporary power of attorney over their financial accounts. According to them, this was just supposed to be for business expenses related to the bar. Nothing major, just a way to make transactions easier and more efficient. They didn't think twice about this arrangement at the time. Tyler was finally doing well, finally focused on something legitimate, and they wanted to show their support and trust in his newfound responsibility. From their perspective, giving him limited financial authority was a reasonable way to help facilitate his success while demonstrating their confidence in his business management abilities. Now, with Tyler completely disappeared and their savings depleted, they were calling me for help. They weren't demanding or expecting anything, but they were asking for some temporary financial support while they tried to get back on their feet and figure out their next steps. My father explained that they were still in the process of understanding exactly what had happened and what their options might be going forward. He said they needed time to sort through the financial wreckage, maybe a few months of help covering their basic bills and living expenses while they worked with banks and lawyers to understand the full extent of the damage. He made it clear that this wouldn't be a permanent arrangement, just temporary assistance until they could stabilize their situation and develop a sustainable plan for moving forward. I asked them the obvious question: why hadn't they consulted with me before signing over legal control of their financial accounts to someone with Tyler's track record? This wasn't a decision that should have been made lightly, especially given Tyler's history of failed ventures and questionable financial judgment. My father's response was both heartbreaking and infuriating in its simplicity. He said they had trusted Tyler completely. They believed he was finally doing well and finally focused on building something legitimate and successful. They wanted to believe in him and support his efforts to create a stable, profitable business. The power of attorney had seemed like a natural extension of that support and confidence. He didn't say any of this with anger or defensiveness, which was perhaps the most telling part of the entire conversation. Instead, there was just exhaustion in his voice, as if the words themselves were heavier than usual and required more effort to speak than they should have. It was the sound of someone who had finally realized the full cost of their choices but was too tired to fight about it anymore. I took the opportunity to remind him that I had warned them about this exact scenario over and over again throughout the years. They had been given every possible chance to recognize Tyler's patterns and stop enabling his behavior before it reached this catastrophic point. I had tried repeatedly to help them see what was coming, but my warnings had been consistently dismissed or ignored. After I said this, my father went completely quiet. The silence stretched on for several long moments, and I could practically hear him processing the reality that all of my predictions had come true exactly as I had said they would. There was nothing he could say to argue with the facts or defend the decisions that had led them to this point. I didn't offer them money during that phone call. I wasn't ready to step back into the role of family problem solver, especially when the problems were entirely self-created and could have been prevented if anyone had listened to my repeated warnings over the years. However, I did say that I would run their situation by a lawyer friend of mine, someone who specialized in sorting out messy financial situations like the one they were facing. I thought it was possible that there might be legal options available to them that they hadn't considered. and professional advice seemed like the most constructive thing I could offer at that moment. I made it absolutely clear that this wasn't me stepping back into the family dynamic or coming to save everyone from the consequences of their choices. This wasn't me accepting responsibility for fixing Tyler's mess or rebuilding what he had destroyed. I was simply willing to help them understand what their options might be and what steps they could take to protect themselves going forward. The lawyer took a few days to thoroughly examine my parents' situation and review all the documentation they could provide. When he finally called me back with his assessment, the news was exactly as bad as I had expected it would be. Since most of Tyler's access to their finances had been arranged through informal agreements and conversations rather than detailed legal contracts, and since the power of attorney document was technically legal and properly executed, there wasn't much that could be done from a legal standpoint. Tyler hadn't actually broken any laws in the traditional sense. He had simply broken trust, which isn't something that courts can easily remedy. There were no signed agreements spelling out specific terms for how the money should be used, no formal contracts outlining his responsibilities, and no clear paper trail that would demonstrate obvious fraud or theft. He had operated within the bounds of the legal authority they had granted him, even though he had clearly violated the spirit of their arrangement. The money was simply gone, and there was no realistic legal pathway to recover it. My parents would have to absorb the financial loss and rebuild their retirement security from whatever resources they had left, which wasn't much after Tyler's devastating spending spree. When I passed this sobering news along to my parents, my mother's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She broke down completely and cried in a way that suggested she was finally grasping the full magnitude of what had happened to them. Through her tears, she said she should have listened to me all those years when I was trying to warn them about Tyler's patterns and behavior. She said she could finally see what I had been trying to tell them for years: that Tyler was manipulative, irresponsible, and ultimately destructive to everyone around him. It was the first time I had ever heard either of my parents acknowledge that my warnings had been accurate and that their enabling behavior had directly contributed to this disaster. I told them I would be willing to help them create a realistic budget based on their remaining resources and help them figure out what they could do with what they had left. I could assist them in developing a practical plan for moving forward and rebuilding some semblance of financial security in their later years. But I set one non-negotiable rule right there during that conversation. I would not be giving them money. Not now, not later, not ever. No loans, no transfers, no financial assistance of any kind. I would provide advice, guidance, and emotional support, but I would not become financially responsible for cleaning up Tyler's mess or compensating for his theft. To their credit, they agreed to this condition without argument. They seemed to understand that they had no right to expect financial assistance from me, especially given how they had treated my warnings and advice over the years. They were grateful for any help I was willing to provide, even if it was limited to guidance rather than direct financial support. News of Tyler's disappearance and the financial devastation he'd left behind spread quickly through our extended family network. One of my uncles called to ask if it was really true that Tyler had run off with their money, and a few cousins sent brief messages asking for confirmation or details about what had happened. I didn't answer most of these inquiries. I had no interest in becoming the family's spokesperson for this situation, or in rehashing the details of Tyler's betrayal with people who had previously dismissed my concerns about his behavior. I just let my phone stay silent and allowed the truth to speak for itself. Tyler's social media presence began vanishing systematically, one platform at a time. His main Facebook page disappeared first, followed by his backup Instagram account a few days later. His LinkedIn profile was deleted, and even his girlfriend's social media pages went dark around the same time. The phone number he had been using was completely disconnected, with no forwarding information or alternative contact method. It was as if Tyler had decided to erase his entire digital identity overnight, removing any trace of his previous life and connections. This wasn't just someone taking a break from social media. This was a deliberate and comprehensive effort to become untraceable and unreachable by anyone from his past. The same relatives who had once told me I was cold, selfish, or bitter for keeping my distance from Tyler and questioning his motives began changing their tune dramatically. Some reached out to ask for updates about the situation. Others sent awkward apologies for not taking my concerns seriously, and most simply went quiet rather than acknowledge how wrong they had been about Tyler's character. The version of me that Tyler had carefully constructed over the years, the one who supposedly abandoned family, who was angry for no good reason, who held grudges just for attention, began falling apart as people finally saw Tyler's true nature revealed through his actions. The lies and manipulations that had painted me as the problem child were suddenly exposed as exactly what they were. Calculated deceptions designed to deflect attention from Tyler's own destructive behavior. But there was no satisfaction in being proven right, no sense of vindication or victory in watching people finally understand what I had been trying to tell them for years. This wasn't the kind of situation where being right felt good, or where I could take any pleasure in having my predictions come true. All I felt was tired. Tired of the whole mess. Tired of the family dynamics that had created this situation, and tired of being expected to have solutions for problems I didn't create. When my family looked to me once again to clean up Tyler's destruction, the only thing I offered them this time was a flashlight to help them see their situation clearly, not a rope to pull them out of the hole they had dug for themselves. I told them clearly and directly that they would have to climb out of this mess themselves. I wasn't going to rescue them from the consequences of choices they had made despite my repeated warnings, and I wasn't going to pretend that my limited assistance was the same as taking responsibility for fixing everything Tyler had broken. A cousin from out of state reached out to me completely out of the blue with something I never would have expected. He sent me a blurry photo that had been taken at a nightclub in Las Vegas, and when I looked at it closely, I could see a man working behind the bar wearing a backwards baseball cap and pouring drinks for customers. The image quality wasn't perfect, but there was something about the person that caught my attention immediately. My cousin had done some additional research and found that this bartender was actually listed on the nightclub's official website under a completely different name than Tyler Miller. However, despite the name change and the attempt at disguise, the face in the photograph was absolutely unmistakable. It was definitely Tyler, clean-shaven and grinning as if nothing had ever happened, acting like he hadn't just destroyed multiple people's financial security and disappeared without a trace. I forwarded the photograph to my parents without any commentary or explanation. I figured the image would speak for itself, and that they would draw their own conclusions about what it meant to see Tyler apparently living it up in Las Vegas while they were back home trying to figure out how to pay their basic bills without dipping into money they had set aside for absolute necessities. My mother's response came after quite a while, and it was exactly the kind of denial I should have expected from her. She replied saying that maybe it wasn't actually Tyler in the photograph. Maybe it was just someone who happened to look like him. And we were jumping to conclusions based on a grainy photo taken in poor lighting conditions at a crowded nightclub. She desperately wanted to believe that this was all some kind of mistake or misidentification. The alternative, accepting that Tyler was really out there living under an assumed name, pretending to be someone else in a different state while they sat back home figuring out how to stretch their remaining money to cover basic necessities, was apparently too painful for her to acknowledge directly. I told my parents straight out that if they wanted definitive proof about whether Tyler was really working at that Las Vegas nightclub, they should hire a private investigator to track him down and verify his identity and location. This wasn't about trying to drag him home against his will or force him to face consequences he was determined to avoid. This was about accountability and getting some concrete answers about what he was doing with the money he had taken from them. It was about having at least some hope of potentially recovering a portion of what had been stolen. And more importantly, it was about getting closure and understanding the full scope of what had been done to them. My parents hesitated when I suggested hiring a private investigator. They said they weren't sure about taking that kind of aggressive step toward Tyler, even given everything that had happened. They were worried about what might happen if their investigation somehow made things worse for everyone involved. More tellingly, they were concerned about what would happen to Tyler's future if he got into legal trouble as a result of their actions. They were still thinking about protecting him and his prospects, even after he had already stolen their financial future and left them struggling to make ends meet in what should have been their comfortable retirement years. I told them as directly as I could that they were still prioritizing Tyler's well-being over their own, even after everything he had done to them. The savings were gone, the trust was destroyed, the time they had lost dealing with this mess couldn't be recovered, and yet their primary concern was still making sure that Tyler didn't face any negative consequences that might interfere with whatever life he was building for himself under his new identity. If protecting Tyler's future was still their main priority after he had already stolen theirs, then nothing had fundamentally changed about their perspective or their willingness to enable his behavior. They were still more concerned about his comfort and security than they were about their own survival and dignity. 3 days after this conversation, my aunt, my father's sister, showed up at my front door completely uninvited. She stood on my porch holding a box of tissues in one hand, and it was obvious from her puffy red eyes that she had been crying extensively before working up the courage to make this visit. She told me she was sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry for the way she had always perceived me and treated me over the years. She said she had always believed the version of my character and motivations that she had heard from my parents and Tyler. According to their stories, I was distant by choice, uncaring by nature, and cold toward the family because of some character flaw or personal inadequacy on my part. She said she now realized that I hadn't been distant at all. I had been tired. Tired of not being listened to when I tried to warn people about obvious problems. Tired of cleaning up after someone who never faced real consequences for his destructive behavior. Tired of being blamed for family problems that I didn't create and couldn't solve on my own. She said she finally understood that my so-called coldness had actually been a reasonable response to years of being taken for granted, ignored, and scapegoated. She could see now that I hadn't withdrawn from the family because I didn't care. I had withdrawn because caring had become too exhausting and emotionally destructive for me to sustain. I let her into my home, and we sat down to have a real conversation about family dynamics, accountability, and the cost of enabling destructive behavior. I didn't ask for her apology, and I hadn't been expecting it, but I didn't turn it away either. It was meaningful to have someone acknowledge what the family dynamic had actually been like, and to have my perspective validated by someone who had witnessed the patterns from the outside. Later that week, my parents reached out to me with what they presented as a peace offering. They wanted to invite me over for dinner so we could sit down together and talk everything through in a civilized manner. From their perspective, this was probably an attempt to return to some kind of normal family dynamic and work through our differences face-to-face over a home-cooked meal. I told them no without any hesitation. My answer was an immediate and unequivocal rejection of their dinner invitation. I explained that if there was anything that genuinely needed to be said between us, it could be communicated over the phone during a straightforward conversation. I wasn't interested in creating artificial intimacy or pretending that sharing a meal would somehow resolve the fundamental issues that had torn our family apart. If they wanted honesty from me, I told them, it wasn't going to come wrapped in pleasantries and served alongside dinner rolls. I was completely done with pretending that everything was normal or acceptable just because we happened to be sitting around a dining room table together. The time for fake smiles and polite conversation had passed years ago. I made it clear that I wasn't going to participate in any more charades designed to make everyone feel better about situations that were fundamentally unacceptable. If they wanted to have real conversations about real problems, we could do that. But it would happen on my terms and without the theatrical elements that were designed to minimize the seriousness of what had occurred. A day after I refused their dinner invitation, I received a text message from an unknown phone number. The message was brief but immediately recognizable in its tone and approach. It contained just one line: "They're turning you against me too." I didn't reply to the message. Instead, I immediately blocked the unknown number permanently, ensuring that no future messages from that source would reach me. I knew without any doubt that the text had come from Tyler, even though he was using a new phone number and trying to reach me through channels I hadn't previously blocked. The phrasing of the message was absolutely textbook Tyler. The assumption that other people were being manipulated rather than making their own informed decisions. The positioning of himself as the victim of some kind of conspiracy, and the guilt-laden implication that I was being unfairly influenced against him rather than responding to his own actions and choices. It was exactly the kind of manipulative communication that Tyler had been using throughout his entire adult life. And I recognized the pattern immediately. He was attempting to plant seeds of doubt about my own judgment and the validity of my anger, suggesting that my negative feelings toward him were the result of outside influence rather than natural consequences of his behavior. After I told my parents that I had received and blocked Tyler's message, they made a request that I found both predictable and infuriating. They asked if I could temporarily unblock him, not permanently, just for a brief period, so they could attempt to set up a phone call or some other form of communication with him. They wanted me to create a window of opportunity that would allow them to reach Tyler through my phone number, since they apparently had no other reliable way to contact him directly. They were hoping that just long enough to facilitate one conversation where they could talk to him about what had happened and potentially work towards some kind of resolution. I told them that this line was never going to be crossed under any circumstances. Not temporarily, not for any reason, and not even to help them achieve what they saw as a reasonable goal. That phone number was blocked permanently, just like all the previous numbers Tyler had used to try to contact me over the years. I made it absolutely clear that Tyler's access to me was completely severed, and I wasn't going to create exceptions or loopholes that would allow him to circumvent the boundaries I had established. If my parents wanted to contact Tyler, they would have to find their own methods that didn't involve using me as an intermediary or compromising the protective measures I had put in place. My father finally said something that I had been waiting to hear for years, though it came far too late to repair the damage that had already been done. He acknowledged that they had enabled Tyler's destructive behavior throughout his life. He admitted that they had consistently made excuses for Tyler's actions and choices, and that they had repeatedly expected me to clean up the messes that Tyler created, simply because I was the one family member who never complained about being given that responsibility. He said they hadn't realized how much they had been leaning on me emotionally and practically until they suddenly found themselves with no one left to lean on. Tyler had disappeared, I had established firm boundaries, and they were finally experiencing what it felt like to deal with the consequences of their choices without having someone else available to absorb the impact and manage the fallout. I told my father that regret was not the same thing as meaningful change. Regret was simply the emotional response that comes from finally realizing you were wrong about something important. Change, on the other hand, meant taking concrete actions to ensure that the same mistakes wouldn't be repeated in the future. I explained that trust doesn't rebuild automatically just because someone finally admits they were wrong and expresses remorse for their actions. Trust rebuilds slowly, and only when consistent actions demonstrate that the person has fundamentally altered their behavior and decision-making processes. Words of regret, while perhaps necessary, were nowhere near sufficient to repair the damage that had been done over years of poor choices and willful blindness to obvious problems. A few days later, someone I barely knew reached out to me through a mutual contact. A friend of a friend from California who had apparently heard about our family's situation through some complex network of connections. She told me she had seen Tyler recently, but the circumstances were even more infuriating than I could have imagined. According to her account, Tyler wasn't just living it up in Las Vegas anymore. Now, he was with a completely new girlfriend, and they were living together in Mexico. Apparently, he had fled the country entirely, and not just for a vacation or temporary escape. She had heard through reliable sources that Tyler had left the United States just before several creditors started pressing serious legal action against him for unpaid debts and fraudulent business practices. She admitted that she had heard this information secondhand rather than witnessing it directly, but she said she trusted the source who had provided the details. The picture she painted was of Tyler living comfortably south of the border with a new romantic partner, completely insulated from the legal and financial consequences of his actions in the United States. I forwarded this message to my father without adding any commentary of my own. I figured the information would speak for itself, and that he could draw his own conclusions about what it meant to learn that Tyler was apparently living freely in another country while they struggled to rebuild their financial security from the ruins he had left behind. My father didn't respond to the message immediately, and when he finally did reach out, it wasn't through a phone call or detailed email. Instead, he sent me a single text message that night that contained just one devastating line. "We lost him, and maybe we lost you too." The weight of that message was enormous. It represented his recognition that Tyler was truly gone, not just missing temporarily or going through a difficult phase, but genuinely lost to them as a son and family member. But perhaps even more significantly, it showed that he was finally acknowledging that their treatment of me over the years had potentially cost them their relationship with me as well. I wrote back with equal brevity, but my response was designed to clarify an important distinction that needed to be made. I replied, "You didn't lose me, you gave me away." After sending that message, I turned off my phone completely, put it in a drawer, and didn't touch it again until the following morning. The difference between losing someone and giving them away was crucial for them to understand. Losing someone implies that their departure was beyond your control, like a tragedy that happened to you. Giving someone away means that your own choices and actions drove them to leave, that you actively contributed to the destruction of the relationship through your decisions and priorities. A week after my father's acknowledgement of loss, I received a call from a phone number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail initially, but when I listened to the message later, I discovered it was from my uncle, my mother's brother, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. We had never been particularly close, and after he moved across the country, our contact had basically stopped entirely. He had left a message saying he'd heard bits and pieces of what was happening with our family from various relatives, but he wanted to know what had actually occurred rather than relying on secondhand accounts and rumors. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the full story rather than just collecting gossip or taking sides in family drama. I called him back later that evening, and he didn't waste any time with small talk or pleasantries. He asked me straight up if it was really true that Tyler had taken money from our parents, disappeared completely, and left them in a desperate financial situation. He wanted to know if the stories he'd been hearing were accurate or if they had been exaggerated through multiple retellings. I told him everything. The entire chronology of events from the power of attorney arrangement to Tyler's disappearance. I explained about the missing retirement savings, the fake names Tyler was apparently using, the photograph from the Las Vegas nightclub, the reports of him living in Mexico, and the years of enabling behavior that had made all of this possible. I also told him about my own role in the situation, how I had repeatedly warned my parents about Tyler's patterns, how my concerns had been dismissed or ignored, how I had been blamed for not being supportive enough, and how Tyler had spread lies about me to other family members to deflect attention from his own behavior. My uncle was silent for a long while after I finished explaining everything. Then he told me something I hadn't expected to hear, something that added another layer to Tyler's pattern of financial manipulation and deception. He revealed that Tyler had borrowed a substantial amount of money from him years earlier, claiming that he needed it for a down payment on commercial kitchen equipment for a catering business he was supposedly starting. Tyler had presented a detailed business plan and seemed genuinely committed to making the venture successful. My uncle had agreed to loan him the money based on Tyler's apparent enthusiasm and the reasonable-sounding business proposal. Tyler had never paid back a single dollar of that loan and had eventually stopped returning my uncle's phone calls entirely when the subject of repayment came up. My uncle had simply assumed that Tyler's catering business was another dead-end hustle that hadn't worked out, and he had chosen to write off the loss rather than create a family conflict over the money. What my uncle hadn't realized until our conversation was that Tyler had been given formal access to our parents' financial accounts and had been systematically draining their retirement savings while presumably living off money borrowed from multiple family members. The scope of Tyler's financial manipulation was apparently much broader than any of us had initially understood. 2 days after my eye-opening conversation with my uncle, he took action that I hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. He didn't call ahead or ask for permission. He simply drove to my parents' house, knocked on their door, and requested a long, serious conversation in their living room about what had been happening to our family. I wasn't present for this conversation, but I heard about it later through another relative who had learned the details secondhand. According to what I was told, my uncle apparently laid out the entire situation with brutal honesty and clarity. He confronted my parents about how they had protected Tyler to the point of enabling his destruction of their own financial security and family relationships. More importantly, he addressed how they had failed to support the one son who had consistently tried to do things right. He pointed out that they had ignored my warnings, dismissed my concerns, and even blamed me for Tyler's actions while simultaneously expecting me to clean up after his mistakes. He made it clear that their treatment of me had been fundamentally unfair and had contributed significantly to the family being torn apart. My uncle also apparently had the courage to tell them that no one else in the family had been willing to stop this destructive pattern from continuing. Everyone had watched Tyler manipulate and exploit my parents' love and loyalty, but no one had intervened to protect them from their own enabling behavior or to advocate for treating me with basic fairness and respect. A few nights after my uncle's intervention, I received an email from my mother that was much longer and more detailed than any communication I had received from her in years. She said she understood my anger toward Tyler and acknowledged that his behavior had been devastating for everyone involved. However, she also said something that revealed how far she still had to go in terms of truly understanding the situation. She wrote that it was time for me to stop dwelling on the past and what had happened. According to her, holding on to anger and resentment about Tyler's actions wouldn't help anyone move forward or rebuild the family relationships that had been damaged. She suggested that maybe, for the sake of preserving what was left of our family, I should consider moving on from these issues and focusing on healing, rather than continuing to rehash old grievances. I replied to her email the next morning with a response that was much shorter but considerably more direct than her message had been. I told her that healing doesn't begin until the truth is faced head-on and acknowledged completely. The truth about Tyler's behavior, about their enabling of that behavior, and about the unfair treatment I had received needed to be confronted honestly before any real progress could be made. I explained that the truth for them still hadn't been fully acknowledged. Not completely, not out loud, and definitely not in a way that matched the scope and severity of the damage that had been done. They were still minimizing the situation, still trying to find ways to avoid taking full responsibility for their choices, and still expecting me to be the one who made sacrifices for the sake of family peace. I made it clear that I wasn't interested in moving on from issues that hadn't been properly addressed, or in pretending that everything was fine when the fundamental problems remained unresolved. Real healing would require them to face the complete truth about what had happened and why, not just the parts they were comfortable acknowledging. Later that same week, another unexpected piece of information came my way through a different channel entirely. A mutual friend who used to work with Tyler several years ago reached out to me and connected me with someone from Tyler's past. A woman who had dated him for over a year during what she thought was a serious relationship. This woman had a story that was both shocking and unfortunately familiar, given what I now knew about Tyler's patterns. She told me that Tyler had stolen thousands of dollars from her during their relationship, using tactics that were remarkably similar to what he had done to our parents. He had claimed to be going through a rough financial patch and had asked for help bridging the gap between two jobs that he claimed to have lined up. Tyler had promised to pay her back as soon as his financial situation stabilized, and he had presented the request as a temporary loan that would be quickly repaid once he got back on his feet. He had been charming, convincing, and apparently sincere in his promises to make things right once his circumstances improved. Instead of repaying the money as promised, Tyler had disappeared from her life completely about a week after gaining access to her credit card information and bank account details. She had filed a police report at the time, but there hadn't been enough concrete evidence for criminal charges to stick. Tyler had been careful and slippery in his methods, always staying just one step ahead of serious legal consequences. She shared everything she had with me. Screenshots of text messages where Tyler made promises he never intended to keep, bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals and charges, and documentation of her attempts to recover the stolen money. She even mentioned that Tyler had an established pattern of switching identities and using fake names to open new credit lines and financial accounts. According to her, Tyler routinely used family names and personal information for security questions and background verification purposes when creating these fraudulent accounts. This explained how he had been able to operate under multiple aliases and why he seemed to have such detailed knowledge of our family's personal information when setting up his various scams and schemes. I gathered all of the evidence and documentation she had sent me and forwarded everything to my parents with a very clear message attached. I told them flat out that if they wanted even the smallest chance of finding peace with this situation, they needed to report Tyler to law enforcement authorities. This wasn't just about protecting themselves or recovering their stolen money. It was about preventing Tyler from continuing to hurt other innocent people who didn't know about his history of manipulation and fraud. I explained that ignoring Tyler's criminal behavior wasn't protection anymore. It was complicity. Every time they chose to protect him from the consequences of his actions, they were helping him hurt someone else, who would become his next victim. The pattern of enabling that had started with small family issues had now escalated to the point where their silence was allowing Tyler to commit serious crimes against strangers who had no way to protect themselves. Their refusal to take action wasn't just about family loyalty at this point. It was about whether they were willing to accept responsibility for the harm that Tyler would continue to cause, as long as he faced no real consequences for his behavior. My parents refused to report Tyler to the authorities, despite all the evidence I had presented, and despite the clear pattern of criminal behavior that was becoming impossible to ignore. They said they couldn't bring themselves to involve law enforcement in what they still saw as a family matter. According to them, Tyler was still their son, no matter what he had done, and they weren't willing to take steps that might result in him facing serious legal consequences. I told them as clearly and directly as I could. Silence isn't love, it's complicity. Every single time they had chosen to protect Tyler from the natural consequences of his actions, they had inadvertently helped him hurt someone else who didn't see the warning signs coming. Their continued protection of Tyler wasn't an act of parental love. It was an endorsement of his criminal behavior that made them partially responsible for the harm he would continue to inflict on innocent people. I explained that now the damage Tyler had caused was circling back to affect them directly, and they were finally experiencing what his other victims had gone through. But instead of learning from this experience and taking steps to prevent future harm, they were still choosing to shield him from accountability, which meant they were actively enabling him to continue victimizing others. That same week, my parents started receiving phone calls from unknown numbers at all hours of the day and night. When they answered these calls, they discovered they were from debt collectors and credit agencies. It turned out that some of the financial accounts Tyler had opened were apparently in my parents' names, using personal information that he had access to while living in their house and managing their affairs. Tyler had used their stored personal information to fraudulently open credit cards, take out a small business loan under false pretenses, and even secure a car rental agreement that they had never signed for or authorized. He had systematically exploited their trust and access to their personal documents to create a web of financial obligations that they knew nothing about until the bills started arriving and collection agencies began calling. When my father finally addressed this latest revelation about Tyler's criminal activity, he didn't argue with me or try to defend Tyler's actions. He just looked away with a defeated expression and said that Tyler had always had a way with people, as if being charming and persuasive somehow made identity theft and financial fraud understandable or forgivable. That was his entire explanation for the situation. Not denial, not rage, not shock at the scope of Tyler's criminal behavior, but just a resigned acknowledgement that Tyler was good at manipulating people. It was as if he thought Tyler's charisma and social skills provided some kind of reasonable excuse for systematic fraud and identity theft. I told my father that this wasn't about charm or social skills. This was about deliberate choices that Tyler had made to commit serious crimes against his own family members. I said, "You didn't just trust him blindly. You ignored me. You ignored every warning I tried to give you, and now everyone is paying the price for your willful blindness to obvious red flags." I explained that their situation wasn't the result of bad luck or Tyler's personality traits. It was the direct consequence of their decision to dismiss clear evidence of problematic behavior and to silence the one person who had tried repeatedly to warn them about what was coming. After saying this, I left their house and drove home, knowing that nothing I could say would change their fundamental approach to dealing with Tyler or accepting responsibility for their own role in enabling his destructive behavior. The silence that followed my departure became just another excuse for them to avoid confronting the reality of their situation. A former co-worker of mine who now works in real estate gave me a call one afternoon with information that I found both predictable and deeply concerning. He mentioned that he had seen my parents' house listed quietly through a private real estate network, the kind of discreet listing system that agents use when property owners don't want their sale to become public knowledge or attract attention from neighbors and acquaintances. He was calling because he was concerned about my family's situation and wanted to know if everything was okay with my parents. I told him honestly that it wasn't my business to discuss their private affairs anymore, but I thanked him for the heads up and for thinking to let me know about what he had observed. Later that week, my parents reached out to me with a new request for assistance. They wanted to know if I had any knowledge of legal methods that could be used to remove a lien that had appeared during their house sale process. It turned out that Tyler's failed sports bar venture had left behind more than just unpaid debts and disappointed creditors. A formal lien had been placed on their house as collateral for one of Tyler's business loans. This lien was tied directly to the financing he had secured for the bar, and it meant that their house couldn't be sold until the debt was satisfied or the lien was legally resolved through proper channels. I told them plainly that there was no shortcut for dealing with this kind of legal complication. There was no trick, no loophole, and no quick fix that would make the lien disappear without proper legal proceedings. What they needed was a competent attorney who specialized in real estate law and debt resolution, someone who could guide them through the proper legal process for addressing the lien. I made it clear that quiet fixes and informal arrangements weren't going to undo what had already been formally filed with the county and recorded as a legal claim against their property. They would need to deal with this situation through official channels, which would likely be time-consuming, expensive, and potentially embarrassing as the full scope of Tyler's financial manipulations became part of the public record. A few days later, I discovered something that was even worse than what I had already learned about my parents' financial situation. Through a conversation with someone who had access to public records, I found out that my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house over a year ago. This wasn't something they had mentioned to anyone, and it certainly wasn't information they had shared with me during any of our recent conversations about their financial difficulties. This second mortgage had been arranged specifically to help fund Tyler's sports bar venture. They had literally put their house, their primary asset and the foundation of their retirement security, at risk to finance another one of Tyler's business schemes. They had never informed anyone about this decision, not even their longtime financial advisor who had been helping them manage their retirement planning for years. The situation with their financial advisor was particularly telling. Apparently, he had noticed significant gaps in the documentation they were providing and had identified serious inconsistencies in their financial reports. When he realized that they had altered important financial disclosures and had deliberately withheld crucial information about their debt obligations, he made the decision to walk away from their account entirely. Their financial advisor, who had worked with them for years and presumably cared about their well-being, had dropped them as clients because he could no longer trust them to be honest about their financial situation. Once he discovered that they were hiding major financial decisions and manipulating the information they provided to him, he concluded that he couldn't effectively help them or protect them from their own poor judgment. The revelation about the second mortgage explained a lot about why they were in such desperate financial straits. It wasn't just that Tyler had stolen their savings. They had also mortgaged their home to fund his failed business venture. They were now facing the possibility of losing their house entirely if they couldn't meet the obligations on both mortgages while dealing with Tyler's other financial crimes. But the financial revelations weren't the end of the story. A friend who still attended my parents' church told me about something unexpected that had happened during a recent group meeting. According to this friend, my mother had experienced some kind of emotional breakdown during the session and had made admissions that were completely out of character for her. During this church group meeting, my mother had broken down completely and admitted publicly that she had spent years favoring Tyler over me. She acknowledged that she had consistently pushed aside warning signs about his behavior and had ignored everything I had ever tried to tell them about Tyler's patterns and problems. She said that it had been easier for her to believe that Tyler had changed, or would change, than to admit that she had been wrong about his character and potential. This was apparently the first time anyone had heard my mother express any kind of genuine remorse for the family dynamics that had led to our current situation. More importantly, it was the first time she had made these admissions in a setting where they weren't aimed directly at me as part of an attempt to guilt me into providing help or forgiveness. The fact that she was finally acknowledging these truths to other people, rather than just to me in private conversations designed to manipulate my response, suggested that she might actually be beginning to understand the scope of what had gone wrong in our family relationships over the years. That same week, a distant relative reached out to me with yet another piece of disturbing information about Tyler's current activities. She had received a video that had been sent to her by a tourist she knew who was traveling in Mexico. The video showed a man dancing drunkenly at a beachfront bar, clearly having an excellent time and completely carefree. When the person taking the video zoomed in for a closer look, the face was unmistakably Tyler's. He looked completely relaxed and happy, surrounded by strangers, swaying to music with a drink in his hand. He wasn't wearing any kind of disguise or trying to hide his identity. He was just living it up like someone who hadn't completely destroyed 3 separate households and disappeared without taking any responsibility for his actions. The video was particularly infuriating because it showed Tyler appearing to have no guilt, no regret, and no concern whatsoever about the devastation he had left behind. While my parents were facing the possibility of losing their home and struggling to figure out how to pay their basic bills, Tyler was apparently enjoying himself at tropical beach bars without a care in the world. I forwarded the video to my parents without any commentary, figuring that seeing Tyler's complete lack of remorse or concern would speak for itself. They didn't reply to my message immediately. Not for 2 days, not for 3 days, and eventually almost a full week passed without any response from either of them. When they finally did respond, it came in the form of a handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox. The letter was several pages long and represented the most comprehensive attempt at an apology that I had received from them throughout this entire ordeal. They acknowledged many of the mistakes they had made and said they were genuinely sorry for letting Tyler's behavior escalate to such a destructive level without stepping in to stop it. They also said they finally understood that they had hurt me deeply through their treatment of me over the years, and they expressed regret for the way they had consistently dismissed my concerns and blamed me for problems that weren't my fault. However, even this heartfelt apology was still wrapped in careful language that danced around the complete truth. They didn't mention the second mortgage they had taken out, didn't admit that they had continued lying even after Tyler's initial theft was discovered, and didn't fully acknowledge the scope of the deception they had engaged in to protect Tyler's reputation at my expense. It was an apology, but it was still an incomplete one that avoided taking full responsibility for all of their choices and actions. Inside the envelope with the letter was a check, not a small amount either. They called it a gesture of goodwill, something to help make things right between us and hopefully close the emotional distance that had developed in our relationship. I mailed the check back to them the same day, along with a brief note that said, "I didn't need money, I needed fairness. That's what you never gave me." At work the next day, my supervisor pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. He had noticed that I seemed distracted and withdrawn over the past few weeks, and he was concerned about my well-being and job performance. Rather than trying to explain the complicated family situation I was dealing with, he simply offered me a few days off to get my personal affairs in order and take care of whatever was affecting me. I didn't argue with his suggestion. I realized that the constant stress of dealing with Tyler's destruction and my parents' enabling behavior was taking a toll on my professional life as well as my personal well-being. I packed a small bag with essentials and decided to drive out of town to visit a longtime friend I hadn't seen in years. We spent several quiet days together just catching up on old times, sharing decent food, and reminiscing about memories from before all the family chaos had consumed so much of my mental energy. My friend didn't pressure me with questions about why I needed to get away or what was troubling me. He just provided the kind of peaceful, supportive environment that allowed me to step back from the constant drama and remember what normal relationships felt like. One evening over dinner, my friend told me something that I didn't realize I needed to hear. He said that stepping away from toxic situations isn't the same thing as quitting or giving up. Sometimes survival looks like silence and distance rather than continued engagement with people who drain your energy and disrespect your boundaries. He explained that leaving isn't betrayal when there's nothing left worth holding on to. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is recognize when a relationship has become fundamentally destructive and walk away before it causes even more damage to your well-being and peace of mind. When I returned home from this restorative trip, I pulled out an old notebook and started writing about everything that had happened. I wasn't writing for anyone else to read, not to post online or publish anywhere, but just to put down on paper the complete story of what I had experienced and how it had affected me. I wrote about every lie I had been told, every moment I was expected to be the bigger person, while Tyler faced no consequences for his actions, and every time I was asked to clean up messes that Tyler had created through his own selfish choices. I documented the pattern of manipulation, the unfair expectations, and the emotional abuse that had been disguised as normal family dynamics. I didn't write any of this for revenge or to hurt anyone. I wrote it because I needed to finally name the true cost of being consistently unheard and undervalued by the people who were supposed to care about me most. Even if no one else would ever read these words, I needed to acknowledge for myself what I had endured and how much it had cost me emotionally over the years. A childhood friend of mine, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, reached out to me through a secure messaging app with information that was both alarming and unfortunately not surprising, given everything else I had learned about Tyler's criminal activities. This friend now worked at a financial institution and wanted to give me a quiet heads up about something he had discovered through his professional responsibilities. Tyler was apparently under investigation for identity theft and bank fraud. His name had come up in connection with a flagged loan application that was tied to a fake business account he had created using fraudulent information. But what had caught my friend's attention specifically was the personal information that appeared on one of the documents Tyler had submitted. The address, email, and even what appeared to be a copy of my signature matched information that belonged to me, not Tyler. These were details from an old version of my personal information, likely pulled from documents or records that had been stored in my parents' house years ago when I still lived there, or used their address for official mail. Tyler had apparently been using my personal information and identity to support his fraudulent financial activities, which meant that I was potentially at risk for being blamed for crimes I had no knowledge of or involvement in. My credit rating, my financial security, and even my legal standing could all be compromised if Tyler's criminal activities were traced back to accounts or applications that used my stolen identity. I didn't wait or hesitate to take action. That same day, I froze my credit with all 3 major credit reporting agencies and activated every fraud alert that was available to protect my accounts and identity. I started the process of securing all of my financial accounts by changing passwords and adding 2-step verification to everything that contained sensitive information. I also ran comprehensive checks on anything that was linked to my social security number, looking for accounts, loans, or credit lines that I hadn't opened myself. I was determined not to take any chances with my financial security, especially after seeing how Tyler had systematically exploited my parents' trust and access to their personal information. Once I had taken all the immediate steps to protect myself, I called my parents to inform them about what I had discovered. I told them that Tyler had been using my personal information for fraudulent purposes, and that his criminal activities had now extended to stealing my identity rather than just their money. Their reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief, but what struck me most was that they seemed genuinely surprised that Tyler would target me specifically. They said they never thought he would go so far as to use my name and personal information in his criminal schemes, as if there was some line they believed he wouldn't cross when it came to his own family members. I made it absolutely clear to them that this was the final boundary that Tyler had crossed, and that there would be no more discussions or negotiations about how to handle his criminal behavior. I told them that if they continued to protect Tyler or refused to cooperate with law enforcement investigations, I would completely cut off all contact with them. No more partial engagement, no more limited help, and no more quiet forgiveness. I explained that either they would finally step up and do the right thing by cooperating with authorities, or I would step away from their lives permanently. There would be no middle ground and no compromise position. Tyler's theft of my identity represented a direct threat to my financial security and legal standing, and I wasn't going to tolerate any continued protection of someone who was actively trying to destroy my life along with theirs. Instead of giving me a direct answer about whether they would cooperate with law enforcement, my parents tried to circumvent the ultimatum I had given them by reaching out through a family intermediary. A cousin called me late in the evening, saying he was just trying to act as a mediator between us and asking if I could give my parents some additional time to figure out their next steps. I shut down this attempt at mediation immediately and told my cousin to stay completely out of the situation. I made it clear that he needed to respect the boundaries I had established and not involve himself in something that wasn't his responsibility to fix or manage. I didn't want allies or intermediaries. I wanted distance from people who couldn't make basic decisions about right and wrong without endless deliberation and family consultation. I told him that my parents had been given a clear choice, and either they would make the right decision or they wouldn't. There was no middle ground, no negotiation period, and no need for family members to get involved in trying to soften or modify the consequences I had outlined. A few days later, another message came to me from a source I hadn't expected. This time, it was from a woman I didn't recognize, but she had found my contact information through a network of people who had been scammed by Tyler over the years. She sent me a comprehensive folder of screenshots, bank statements, and written complaints that documented her own experience with Tyler's fraudulent schemes. She had been one of Tyler's girlfriends from the period before he opened the sports bar, and he had managed to scam her out of several $1,000s through a combination of manipulation and false promises. Tyler had convinced her to co-sign a lease for what he claimed was a legitimate business opportunity, and he had also persuaded her to invest money in a fake social media marketing agency that existed only on paper. After Tyler had gotten access to her money and financial information, he had vanished from her life just as completely as he had disappeared from our family's lives. She told me something that many of Tyler's other victims had started to say. Tyler used our parents' unwavering loyalty and support like a safety net that allowed him to take greater risks with other people's lives and money. He knew that no matter what he did or how badly his schemes failed, our parents would always be there to cover for him, provide excuses for his behavior, and assume that he meant well despite all evidence to the contrary. This unconditional family support gave him the confidence to hurt people who didn't have the same insider knowledge about his patterns and character. I sent all of the documentation she had provided to the legal contact I had been working with since I first froze my credit and started protecting myself from Tyler's identity theft. My lawyer added her evidence to an ongoing fraud investigation that was building around Tyler's activities, and by this point the case file had grown to include multiple instances of stolen identity, fake business ventures, and misused family information. There was enough evidence accumulated to build a comprehensive picture for investigators that showed Tyler's criminal behavior spanning multiple years and involving numerous victims across several states. I also filed my own formal police report, not just to protect myself from future identity theft, but to assist anyone else who might be caught up in Tyler's web of fraud and deception. I didn't want more innocent people to get hurt because Tyler had access to too much information about our family's personal details and security questions. By creating an official record of his identity theft and fraud, I was helping to build a case that could potentially prevent him from victimizing additional people who had no way to protect themselves. Word about the formal police reports and the ongoing investigation spread quickly through our extended family network. Some relatives started quietly distancing themselves from the situation, while others who had previously made excuses for Tyler's behavior by saying things like, "He's just lost," or "He'll figure it out eventually," stopped making those comments altogether. A few family members tried reaching out to me, but not with support or offers of help. Instead, they were expressing concern that I was taking things too far by involving law enforcement. They suggested that there was still time to patch things up within the family if I would just let go of my anger and resentment toward Tyler and my parents. I told one of these concerned relatives very directly that Tyler had ruined our family relationships through his own choices and actions. I was simply choosing not to go down with the ship he had already sunk. I wasn't the one who had created this mess, and I wasn't responsible for pretending it wasn't as serious as it actually was just to make other people more comfortable with the situation. At work, I was invited to give a short presentation during a leadership training seminar on the topic of ethical decision-making under pressure. I didn't mention my family situation explicitly, not once during the entire presentation, but everyone who knew me well understood what the underlying message was about. The presentation wasn't about policy compliance or regulatory requirements. It was about knowing when doing the right thing means walking away from situations that compromise your integrity and well-being. It was about recognizing when loyalty becomes enabling, and when trying to preserve relationships actually prevents people from facing necessary consequences for their destructive behavior. After giving that presentation, I made the decision to update all of my important legal documents and records. I revised my will, updated my power of attorney designations, changed my emergency contacts, and modified my medical directives. Every single family member who had once told me to stay quiet, to forgive and forget, and to cover for Tyler one more time was completely removed from these legal documents. I didn't provide explanations or have conversations about these changes. I just made final decisions about who I trusted with important aspects of my life and backed those decisions up with proper legal paperwork. The people who had spent years pressuring me to enable Tyler's destructive behavior were no longer going to have any official role in my personal or financial affairs. A call came in from one of the investigators I had been working with since I first submitted documents related to Tyler's fraudulent activities. This time, the contact was completely official rather than just an informal update about the case's progress. The investigation had advanced significantly, and they had managed to track Tyler's criminal activity across multiple jurisdictions and aliases. The investigators had discovered that Tyler was operating under at least 3 different false identities, and he was using these aliases across 2 different states as well as parts of Mexico. Each fake identity came with its own elaborate set of supporting documentation, including fraudulent credit lines, rental agreements, and business registrations. The scope of his criminal enterprise was far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. More importantly, each of these false identities was connected to its own set of fraud reports and victim complaints. Tyler hadn't just stolen from our family and disappeared. He had been systematically victimizing people for years, moving from location to location and identity to identity to avoid being caught and held accountable for his crimes. The investigators asked if I would be willing to cooperate formally with their case by providing official testimony and documentation that could help strengthen their prosecution. They explained that my evidence and witness testimony could be crucial in establishing Tyler's pattern of identity theft and financial fraud, particularly the evidence showing how he had used family information and relationships to facilitate his criminal activities. I agreed to cooperate without any hesitation. My lawyer compiled everything we had gathered over the previous months: screenshots from the various women Tyler had scammed, testimony from the friend who worked in finance and had flagged Tyler's fraudulent loan applications, documentation from my credit freeze and identity protection measures, and all of my personal statements detailing the timeline of Tyler's escalating criminal behavior. My lawyer submitted a comprehensive affidavit that laid out the complete timeline of Tyler's financial abuse, identity misuse, and his systematic pattern of manipulation that had been developing over almost a decade. The document connected Tyler to a complex web of fraud that involved multiple victims across state lines, showing that his criminal behavior wasn't just opportunistic, but carefully planned and executed. There was enough evidence compiled in the case file to demonstrate that Tyler had been building this criminal enterprise for years, using family relationships and romantic relationships as cover for increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. The investigators now had sufficient documentation to pursue serious federal charges that could result in significant prison time. Not long after I submitted my formal cooperation with the investigation, I received something completely unexpected in the mail. It was a handwritten letter from one of my old high school teachers, someone I hadn't spoken to or thought about in years. He had apparently heard about the investigation through local community discussions and wanted to share something with me that he thought might be relevant. In his letter, he recalled how even back during our high school years, Tyler had consistently bent rules, lied his way out of difficult situations, and used his natural charisma to manipulate teachers and administrators into giving him sympathy and second chances. Meanwhile, I had often been the one who ended up dealing with the consequences or fallout from Tyler's irresponsible behavior. He specifically remembered an incident involving a group project where Tyler had completely skipped all of the work and responsibilities, but had somehow managed to charm his way out of failing grades. Instead, I had been the one called in for a behavioral conference because the teacher assumed that as the older brother, I should have been supervising Tyler's contributions to the project and ensuring he met his obligations. The teacher said he regretted not speaking up at the time when he witnessed this unfair treatment. He realized now that the pattern of Tyler avoiding consequences while I was held responsible for his failures had been evident even during our teenage years, and he wished he had intervened to protect me from this dynamic rather than allowing it to continue unchallenged. I sent a photograph of this letter to my parents, not to create additional guilt or to stir up old resentments, but simply to demonstrate that Tyler's manipulative and irresponsible behavior wasn't something new or recent. This pattern had been consistent throughout our entire lives, and people outside our family had been able to observe it even when our parents chose to ignore or rationalize it away. The letter from my teacher was evidence that the problems I had been pointing out for years weren't imaginary, weren't exaggerated, and weren't the result of sibling rivalry or jealousy. Tyler's character issues and manipulative behavior had been visible to outsiders from a very early age, which meant that my parents' continued enabling of his behavior represented a deliberate choice to ignore obvious warning signs rather than a case of being deceived by someone who was skilled at hiding his true nature. My parents never replied to the message containing the teacher's letter. They didn't offer any explanation, defense, or acknowledgement of what the letter revealed about their long-term enabling of Tyler's problematic behavior. Their silence at this point had become its own kind of answer. They were no longer even attempting to justify or explain their choices, which suggested they finally understood the full scope of what they had allowed to happen. I didn't follow up with them or try to prompt a response. Their silence told me everything I needed to know about their willingness to face the complete truth about Tyler and about their own role in enabling his destructive behavior for so many years. A few weeks later, news broke that changed everything about Tyler's situation and forced my parents to finally confront the reality they had been avoiding for so long. Tyler's current girlfriend had been arrested while trying to cash a forged check at a bank, and she was using one of Tyler's fake identities when she was caught. During her processing and questioning, she gave a detailed statement to law enforcement that led investigators directly to a storage unit that was rented under her name. When authorities searched this storage unit, they found extensive files and materials that were directly linked to multiple identity theft scams, including documentation that contained our parents' social security numbers and copies of their old financial records. This discovery finally forced my parents' hand in a way that all of my warnings and evidence had never been able to accomplish. They could no longer pretend that Tyler was just going through a difficult phase or that his criminal behavior was limited to taking money from the sports bar. The evidence was now undeniable that Tyler had been systematically stealing their personal information and using it to commit federal crimes across multiple states. Faced with this irrefutable proof of Tyler's criminal enterprise and the direct threat it posed to their own financial and legal security, my parents quietly retained a criminal defense lawyer. This was something I had been urging them to do for months, but they had resisted because they didn't want to take any action that might result in Tyler facing serious legal consequences. Word about my parents hiring a criminal defense lawyer spread quickly throughout our extended family network, though no one said much about it openly. The relatives who had spent years insisting that Tyler was just misunderstood or going through a difficult phase had all gone completely quiet. Even the family members who had once sworn that Tyler would eventually figure things out and make everyone proud had stopped making those optimistic predictions entirely. The reality of federal criminal charges and evidence stored in a rented facility had finally made it impossible for anyone to continue making excuses for Tyler's behavior, or pretending that this was just a temporary family disagreement that would blow over with time and forgiveness. Around this time, I made the decision to start therapy. This wasn't because of the legal stress or the complexity of dealing with Tyler's criminal case, but because I had finally realized that I had been carrying emotional weight that I didn't know how to set down on my own. I had spent years being told to be patient with Tyler, years being held responsible for maintaining family peace that was never reciprocal, and years accepting treatment that I never should have tolerated. I began attending therapy sessions once a week, and for the first time in my adult life, I started making connections between what I had accepted from Tyler and my parents and similar patterns in other relationships throughout my life. I began to understand how growing up in a family that confused tolerance with loyalty had affected my ability to set healthy boundaries with people who took advantage of my willingness to be understanding and accommodating. My therapist helped me recognize that the family dynamic I had grown up with wasn't normal or healthy, even though it had been presented to me as the standard for how families should operate. Learning to distinguish between reasonable requests for support and manipulative demands designed to exploit my sense of responsibility was a crucial step in my healing process. At one point during this period of self-reflection and therapy, I wrote a letter to Tyler that ended up being over 10 pages long. I poured everything into this letter. Every betrayal I had witnessed, every moment I had been told to be the bigger person, while Tyler faced no consequences for his destructive actions, and every instance where I had been expected to clean up messes that Tyler had created through his own selfish choices and criminal behavior. I wrote about the years of manipulation, the unfair expectations that had been placed on me, and the emotional abuse that had been disguised as normal family dynamics. I documented how Tyler had systematically used our parents' love and loyalty as a shield to protect himself from accountability while he hurt innocent people who trusted him. When I finished writing this comprehensive letter, I made a deliberate decision to shred it completely. There was nothing Tyler could possibly give me in return that I hadn't already found through my own healing process and the supportive relationships I was building outside of my family. The letter had served its purpose by helping me process and articulate my experiences, but Tyler himself no longer deserved access to my thoughts or emotions. A few days after I destroyed that letter, I received some genuinely good news that had nothing to do with Tyler or the ongoing legal situation. I was offered a promotion at work that came with new responsibilities, significantly better pay, and an opportunity to move into the downtown office location on a full-time basis. I accepted the promotion immediately. It represented a clean break from my current work environment and a chance to start fresh in a new physical space that had no history or memories connected to the family drama that had consumed so much of my energy over the past several years. Every day when I came home from my new office, I wouldn't be reminded of the times I had rushed out to handle Tyler's crises or fielded phone calls from my parents about his latest problems. Shortly after I started my new position, I received a group message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. They were organizing a family reunion for the upcoming holidays and wanted to make sure everyone in the extended family knew about the plans and could participate in coordinating the event. I didn't even bother to open the entire message thread or read through the details of what was being planned. I simply deleted the group message without responding or acknowledging that I had received it. My phone number hadn't changed, and my family had every opportunity over the years to stand up for me, listen to my warnings, or treat me with basic fairness and respect. Their silence during all the years when I needed support had been their choice, just like my silence now was mine. I had no interest in pretending that we were all one big happy family, when the people organizing this reunion had watched me be scapegoated and blamed for Tyler's actions without ever speaking up on my behalf. In one of my therapy sessions, my therapist helped me reframe my understanding of the past in a way that was both healing and empowering. She explained that the goal wasn't to erase what had happened or pretend that the pain hadn't been real, but rather to choose what aspects of my history I would continue to give power over my present and future. The experiences I had survived weren't burdens that I had to carry forever. They were proof that I had the strength and resilience to endure difficult circumstances and still build a meaningful life for myself. The goal of therapy wasn't to forget about Tyler or my parents, but to make sure that their dysfunction and poor choices didn't continue to dictate how I approached new relationships and opportunities. That night, after this particularly meaningful therapy session, I sat down with my phone and laptop and made a systematic decision to clean house digitally. I deleted every voicemail I had saved, every text message that was connected to family drama, and every photograph that included Tyler or captured moments from the toxic family dynamics I was working to move beyond. The only digital evidence I kept was documentation that might still be needed for the ongoing legal investigation and prosecution. Everything else, all the proof of conversations, arguments, and attempts at manipulation was permanently deleted from my devices and accounts. I didn't need to maintain evidence of a story that didn't deserve to follow me into the next chapter of my life. Holding on to these digital reminders of past conflicts and family dysfunction wasn't helping me heal or grow. It was just giving the toxic dynamics continued influence over my emotional well-being and mental space. My lawyer called with an update that I hadn't expected to come so quickly, and the news was more significant than anything we had heard since the investigation first began. Tyler had been caught at the US-Mexico border while attempting to re-enter the United States using stolen identity documents. One of the fake names he was trying to use had already been flagged in the ongoing fraud investigation, so when Border Patrol agents scanned his fraudulent paperwork, every alarm in their system immediately activated. The border arrest meant that Tyler's case was now escalating from a multi-state fraud investigation to a federal matter involving immigration violations and identity document fraud. The charges he was facing had suddenly become much more serious, and the potential penalties had increased dramatically due to the federal nature of his crimes and his attempt to flee the country to avoid prosecution. The authorities requested that I provide a formal victim statement for Tyler's upcoming trial proceedings. I was advised by both my lawyer and the prosecution team to keep my statement focused strictly on factual information rather than emotional responses or personal opinions about Tyler's character. They wanted a detailed, objective account of what had happened to me and how Tyler's criminal activities had affected my life and financial security. I spent several days preparing a comprehensive statement that outlined the financial damage Tyler had caused, the identity theft he had committed using my personal information, the fraudulent accounts that had been opened in my name, and the extensive time and money I had been forced to spend monitoring and securing my financial information because of his criminal actions. I included documentation of all the protective measures I had been required to take: credit freezes, fraud alerts, account changes, and legal consultations, along with a timeline showing how Tyler's escalating criminal behavior had forced me to treat my own family members as potential security threats to my financial well-being. I submitted this victim statement along with all of the supporting documents and evidence that my lawyer had compiled over the months since Tyler's criminal activities had first been discovered. After providing this formal cooperation with the prosecution, I made a deliberate decision to stay out of the rest of the legal proceedings and let the justice system handle Tyler's case without any further involvement from me. The case began gaining local media attention after a reporter picked up on the story and started investigating the multiple charges Tyler was facing across different jurisdictions. When Tyler's mugshot appeared in the newspaper, alongside headlines about stolen identities and multi-state financial crimes, the scope of his criminal enterprise became public knowledge for the first time. The border arrest and federal charges had elevated Tyler's case from a local family drama to a legitimate news story about sophisticated financial fraud and identity theft. The fact that Tyler had been caught trying to re-enter the country using false documents while already under investigation for multiple fraud charges made the story particularly compelling for local media outlets. My parents responded to this public attention by quietly withdrawing from virtually all of their normal social activities and community involvement. They stopped attending church services regularly. My mother stepped back from several community groups she had been active in for years, and they both began declining invitations to social events where they might be asked uncomfortable questions about Tyler's criminal case. One of their longtime friends told me privately that my parents had said they were too ashamed to face anyone in their social circle right now. They felt like everyone who knew them was either judging them for raising a criminal or feeling sorry for them because their son had destroyed their financial security and family reputation. This public shame didn't bring me any sense of satisfaction or vindication. I hadn't been hoping for my parents to experience humiliation or social isolation. I had simply wanted them to acknowledge the truth about Tyler's character and stop enabling his destructive behavior. The shame they were feeling now was a natural consequence of years of poor choices, but it wasn't something I had wished for or taken pleasure in witnessing. What I had wanted from them was honesty and accountability, not embarrassment and withdrawal from their community. The fact that they were now dealing with the social consequences of Tyler's crimes didn't change the fundamental issues that had torn our family apart or repair the damage that had been done to our relationships. A maternal aunt reached out to me during this period, offering to provide testimony about the family dynamics she had witnessed over the years. She said she had observed how my parents consistently favored Tyler from early childhood, how I had been expected to carry disproportionate responsibility for family problems, and how Tyler had been praised for meeting bare minimum expectations while my genuine achievements were taken for granted. I thanked her for the offer to testify on my behalf, but I explained that it wasn't necessary for Tyler's criminal trial. I had already provided sufficient evidence and documentation to support the prosecution's case, and I didn't need additional proof of the family dynamics that had enabled Tyler's behavior over the years. The trial wasn't about family relationships or parenting decisions. It was about law enforcement and finally holding Tyler accountable for the specific crimes he had committed. While I appreciated my aunt's willingness to validate my experiences, Tyler's sentencing would be based on legal evidence rather than testimony about family dysfunction. During one of the early court hearings in Tyler's case, a short video clip began circulating online that perfectly captured his attitude toward the legal proceedings and the people he had victimized. The video showed Tyler standing before the judge with his arms crossed and his lips curled in an unmistakable smirk, displaying no remorse, no apology, and no acknowledgement of the harm he had caused to multiple families and individuals. His body language and facial expression conveyed pure arrogance, as if the entire legal process was beneath him and he couldn't be bothered to show even minimal respect for the court or concern for his victims. There was no indication that he understood or cared about the devastation he had caused to people who had trusted him, including his own family members. Some of our extended family members saw this video clip and quietly stopped mentioning Tyler's name in any context. The image of him showing such blatant disrespect and lack of remorse finally convinced even the most optimistic relatives that there was nothing redeemable about his character or his approach to the consequences of his actions. Bail was denied for Tyler during his court proceedings. The judge ruled that with his history of using multiple aliases and his demonstrated pattern of fleeing across international borders to avoid legal consequences, Tyler represented a clear flight risk. He would remain in custody throughout the entire trial and sentencing process, with no opportunity for release even with supervised conditions or electronic monitoring. This decision meant that Tyler's days of living freely while his victims dealt with the aftermath of his crimes were finally over. For the first time in his adult life, he was going to face real consequences that he couldn't charm his way out of, manipulate away, or escape by simply moving to a new location with a new identity. My parents made the choice not to attend Tyler's court hearings, though I didn't ask them directly about their reasons for staying away. Someone close to them mentioned privately that they claimed they weren't ready to face the legal proceedings, either emotionally or socially. They were still struggling to accept the reality of Tyler's criminal behavior and weren't prepared to sit in a courtroom and hear the full scope of his crimes laid out in official legal testimony. For the first time since Tyler's criminal activities had been discovered, no one tried to pull me into the situation to mediate, explain, or provide emotional support for my parents' difficult feelings. They were finally dealing with the consequences of their choices without expecting me to help them process or manage their emotional responses. A financial recovery service contacted me several weeks later as part of their work with law enforcement on victim reimbursement from assets that had been frozen during Tyler's investigation and arrest. They were attempting to recover money for Tyler's victims using funds and property that had been seized as part of the criminal case against him. I completed all of the required forms and submitted the comprehensive documentation they requested to support my claim for financial damages. The process was lengthy and required detailed records of all the identity protection measures I had been forced to implement because of Tyler's theft of my personal information. Several weeks after submitting my reimbursement paperwork, I received a check that represented a partial recovery of the financial costs I had incurred protecting myself from Tyler's identity theft. It wasn't enough to cover everything I had spent on credit monitoring, legal consultations, and account security measures, but it was a meaningful gesture toward financial resolution and closure. More importantly, the reimbursement represented official acknowledgement that I had been a legitimate victim of Tyler's criminal enterprise, not just a family member who was overreacting to normal sibling conflicts or holding grudges about minor disagreements. Around this time, a journalist reached out to me with a request for an interview. She was working on a comprehensive article about financial fraud within families and the systemic denial that often allows these crimes to continue and escalate. She wanted to explore how family loyalty can become a shield that enables criminal behavior and prevents victims from seeking help or protection. I agreed to speak with her, but only under two non-negotiable conditions: complete anonymity for me and my family, and absolutely no use of family photographs or any other identifying information that could connect the story to our real identities. I wanted to share my experience to potentially help other people in similar situations, but I wasn't willing to sacrifice my privacy or expose my parents to additional public scrutiny. The journalist honored both of my conditions completely. The article was published several weeks later, with all identifying details changed or removed, but the core story and its lessons remained intact and powerful. What I hadn't expected was how many people would relate to the experiences described in the article. Hundreds of readers left comments sharing their own stories of family betrayal, stolen trust, and relatives who had been given endless second chances while their victims were told to be understanding and forgiving. Many people described feeling isolated and confused because they were told that family comes first, even when family members were actively harming them. The article resonated with people who had experienced similar patterns of manipulation, enabling, and scapegoating within their own families. Reading these responses helped me understand that the dysfunction I had grown up with wasn't unique or rare. It was actually a common pattern that many people recognized from their own lives but had never seen discussed openly in a public forum. The response to the article didn't use my real name or reveal my identity, but my own words and experiences had somehow managed to reach people who needed to hear that they weren't alone in dealing with toxic family dynamics, and that choosing to protect yourself isn't the same as being cruel or unforgiving. The court eventually announced Tyler's sentencing date, and I marked it on my calendar briefly before removing it entirely. I had made the decision that I wouldn't be attending the sentencing hearing, not because I wasn't interested in the outcome, but because I didn't need to hear Tyler's sentence spoken aloud in a courtroom to know that justice was finally being served. I had already heard every excuse, justification, and manipulation that Tyler was capable of producing, and I had no interest in giving him one final opportunity to perform for an audience or try to generate sympathy through false remorse or calculated emotional appeals. The legal system would handle Tyler's punishment based on the evidence and the law, and that was sufficient for me. I didn't need the theater of a courtroom appearance to feel confident that Tyler was finally facing appropriate consequences for his actions. One afternoon during this period, a letter arrived in my mailbox from someone I had almost forgotten about. An old neighbor from my childhood who I hadn't spoken to since we were in high school together. The letter was brief but deeply meaningful, containing just one sentence that somehow captured everything I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate clearly. The letter simply said, "You deserved better. I hope you found peace." This unexpected validation from someone who had witnessed our family dynamics from the outside during our formative years meant more to me than any court verdict or legal resolution ever could. It was acknowledgement from an objective observer that the treatment I had received hadn't been normal or acceptable, and that my decision to distance myself from that toxicity had been reasonable and healthy. I kept that letter, not because I needed ongoing validation of my choices, but because it represented a moment of unexpected kindness and understanding from someone who had no obligation to reach out but had chosen to offer support anyway. Soon after receiving that meaningful letter from my old neighbor, my company offered me an incredible opportunity that would change the trajectory of my entire life. They wanted me to take a leadership role at their overseas branch, a long-term position that would involve working with a better team structure and significantly improved working conditions. Most importantly, it represented a complete change of environment that would allow me to start fresh in a place with no history connected to my family's dysfunction. I didn't hesitate for even a moment when considering this offer. I signed the paperwork the same week it was presented to me, eager to embrace the opportunity for a completely new chapter in my life that would be built on my own choices and achievements rather than defined by the toxic relationships I was leaving behind. Before departing from my new position overseas, I decided to make one final trip back to the house where I had grown up. This wasn't a sentimental journey or an attempt to reconnect with my parents. It was a practical mission to clear out the last of my personal belongings that were still stored in their basement and attic spaces. I went through everything systematically, donating the few items that were still useful and throwing away the rest without ceremony or nostalgia. I made a deliberate decision not to keep a single family heirloom, photograph, or memento that would create emotional ties to the past I was working to move beyond. No family photos from holidays or birthdays, no gifts that carried memories of better times, no souvenirs from family trips or special occasions. Nothing that would pull me back emotionally to relationships that had proven to be fundamentally destructive to my well-being and peace of mind. When my plane lifted off from the runway, I made a conscious choice not to check my phone messages or wonder who might be trying to call me with last-minute appeals or attempts at reconciliation. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of relief that didn't come with accompanying guilt or doubt about whether I was making the right decision. The feeling of freedom that came with leaving wasn't tainted by second-guessing or worry about family members I was leaving behind. I knew with complete certainty that I was finally prioritizing my own mental health and future happiness over the exhausting obligation to manage other people's poor choices and their consequences. Settling into life in Copenhagen turned out to be much smoother than I had expected it would be. The city operated with a kind of calm, efficient rhythm that felt like a perfect match for my personality and professional style. Everything moved at a pace that was both productive and humane, efficient and focused, but also polite and respectful of personal boundaries. My new role at the company's international division started the day after I arrived in the city, and I was immediately impressed by how different the workplace culture was from what I had been accustomed to back home. The office ran on clear systems and mutual respect between colleagues and supervisors. Meetings actually ended on time as scheduled. No one overstepped professional boundaries or tried to involve personal drama in work relationships, and supervisors didn't blur the lines between professional responsibilities and emotional manipulation. Everyone simply showed up each day, did their jobs competently and professionally, and left the office at reasonable hours without creating unnecessary drama or conflict. It was exactly the kind of stable, respectful environment that I had been craving after years of dealing with family members who couldn't maintain basic boundaries or treat each other with consistency and fairness. A few weeks into my new position, I was asked to mentor a junior analyst who had recently joined the company. He was bright, curious, and genuinely eager to learn from more experienced colleagues, which reminded me of my own early career enthusiasm before family obligations and drama had started consuming so much of my mental energy and emotional bandwidth. We kept our professional conversations focused and productive, but over time a kind of quiet trust developed between us that was based on mutual respect and shared work goals rather than complicated personal dynamics or hidden agendas. Working with him reminded me of what healthy professional relationships were supposed to feel like: supportive, collaborative, and free from the emotional manipulation and guilt-based obligations that had characterized so many of my family interactions. One evening after we had finished reviewing monthly reports together, I decided to check my personal email for the first time in several days. There was a new message from an email address I recognized but hadn't seen in over a year. It was from my father. The email had no subject line and contained only 5 words in the entire message. "You were right. We failed." I read those 5 words several times, processing the weight of what my father was finally acknowledging after years of denial, excuse-making, and blame-shifting. This was the closest thing to a complete admission of responsibility that I had ever received from either of my parents, and it represented a fundamental shift in how they understood the family dynamics and their own role in enabling Tyler's destructive behavior. However, instead of feeling vindicated or satisfied by this long-overdue acknowledgement, I simply archived the email without responding and shut my laptop. I had moved beyond the point where their admissions of fault could provide me with the validation or closure I had once desperately wanted from them. Their recognition of the truth was years too late to repair the damage that had been done, and I had already found peace and purpose in my new life that didn't depend on their approval or understanding. I didn't need them to validate my perspective anymore because I had built a life based on my own values and surrounded myself with people who treated me with the respect and fairness I deserved. That night, I slept completely uninterrupted for the first time in months. There were no anxious thoughts about family crises, no worry about what Tyler might do next, and no guilt about whether I should be doing more to help people who had consistently refused to help themselves or treat me with basic decency. A week later, my lawyer followed up with the final update about Tyler's legal case. Tyler had been sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, which meant he would finally face real consequences for his criminal behavior that he couldn't charm his way out of or escape by moving to a new location with a new identity. There were still 2 additional cases pending against Tyler, one related to the identity theft charges from his border arrest, and another involving a fraudulent investment group he had operated in Florida before disappearing to Mexico. The legal system was still unraveling pieces of Tyler's criminal enterprise, but the main chapter of accountability was finally closed. Tyler would not be walking away from this situation like he had managed to escape consequences for his behavior throughout his entire adult life. For once, his actions would result in proportional consequences that matched the severity of the harm he had caused to his victims. I took the comprehensive legal information about Tyler's sentencing and went through all of my personal records to update everything that might be affected by this final resolution. I revised my emergency contacts, updated my will and medical directives, and made sure that no family members were included in any of my important legal documents or decision-making processes. This wasn't done out of spite or anger, but rather for complete clarity about who I trusted with major decisions about my life and future. There was simply no one left in my original family circle whom I trusted to make responsible choices or act in my best interest when difficult decisions needed to be made. The people who had spent years dismissing my concerns, enabling Tyler's destructive behavior, and expecting me to sacrifice my own well-being for the sake of family peace were not the people I wanted making important decisions about my healthcare, finances, or personal affairs if I became unable to advocate for myself. Gradually, I began building new relationships in Copenhagen that were based on mutual respect, shared interests, and healthy boundaries rather than guilt, obligation, and historical family dynamics. I joined a language class to improve my Danish skills and started attending a local book discussion group where people gathered to talk about literature and ideas rather than personal drama or family problems. I kept my participation in these activities relatively surface level at first, never volunteering much information about my past or the reasons I had moved to Denmark. But over time, as I spent more time around people who didn't expect me to carry someone else's emotional baggage or clean up after other people's mistakes, I found it easier to open up and form genuine connections. The more I interacted with people who treated relationships as mutual exchanges of support and respect rather than one-sided arrangements where one person was always expected to give while others only took, the more I understood how abnormal my family dynamics had actually been throughout my entire life. One evening at a casual dinner with several coworkers, someone mentioned personal blogging as a way to process difficult experiences and emotions without necessarily sharing them publicly or performing for an audience. They talked about using writing as a tool for self-reflection and healing rather than as a way to seek validation or sympathy from others. I didn't say much during that conversation, but the idea stayed with me throughout the following week. Eventually, I decided to set up a private blog, just a blank digital space where I could pour out my thoughts and experiences in a way that felt completely honest and unfiltered. This wasn't about reliving traumatic experiences or dwelling on past pain, but rather about explaining what had happened to me in a way that might help other people recognize similar patterns in their own lives and relationships. I wanted to document the process of recognizing toxic family dynamics and choosing to prioritize my own well-being over other people's comfort with the status quo. A few months into maintaining this private blog, something unexpected happened. A message came through the blog's contact form from someone who had somehow found and read my posts. The message was anonymous, but the person said they had read every entry I had written and that my experiences had helped them realize they were enabling a sibling in exactly the same way my parents had enabled Tyler. This person explained that they had been told for years that forgiveness meant accepting unacceptable behavior, that family loyalty required endless second chances, and that being available to help no matter what was the standard for how families should operate. They said that reading about my experiences had helped them understand that they were being manipulated and taken advantage of rather than loved and appreciated. Most importantly, they were now stepping away from these toxic family dynamics and reclaiming the mental and emotional space that had been consumed by their siblings' constant crises and demands for support. They were learning to distinguish between reasonable requests for help and manipulative demands designed to exploit their sense of responsibility and family obligation. That single anonymous message accomplished something that no court ruling, criminal conviction, or family apology ever could have achieved. It meant that my experience hadn't ended with me. It had helped stop a similar pattern of destruction from continuing in someone else's family. The pain and dysfunction I had endured had been transformed into something that could actually prevent other people from going through similar experiences. Not long after receiving that meaningful message, I made the decision to adopt a rescue dog from a local animal shelter that was located just a few blocks from my apartment. The dog I chose was quiet and observant, with sharp, intelligent eyes that suggested he didn't trust new people easily or quickly. We understood each other almost immediately. Neither of us was looking for overwhelming displays of affection or emotional intensity. We both needed stability, consistency, and the kind of quiet companionship that doesn't come with hidden agendas or unspoken expectations. I named him Justice, which felt appropriate given the journey I had taken to reach this point of peace and clarity in my life. On what would have been Tyler's birthday, a date I remembered only because it appeared on my old calendar before I had systematically removed all family-related reminders from my personal scheduling, I decided to take a solo hiking trip through one of the beautiful forest trail systems located just outside Copenhagen. I didn't go on this hike to mourn Tyler or to feel sad about the family relationships that had been lost. Instead, I went to remind myself of where I stood now in my life and to acknowledge how far I had traveled, both literally and emotionally, from the toxic dynamics that had once defined my daily existence. I had walked through fire, metaphorically speaking, and I hadn't carried the smoke with me into my new life. The damage that had been done to me hadn't defined my future or limited my ability to build healthy, fulfilling relationships with people who treated me with respect and fairness. Standing alone in that peaceful forest, surrounded by natural beauty and complete quiet, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for my own strength and resilience. I had survived experiences that could have broken me, and instead of being diminished by them, I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of recognizing and maintaining healthy boundaries in all of my relationships. I never reconnected with my parents after that final email from my father. There were no additional phone calls, no holiday cards, no attempts at reconciliation or family healing. Their silence had become permanent, but unlike the painful silences of the past, this one didn't cause me any emotional distress or make me question my own choices. Their continued silence actually communicated more clearly than any words could have. It told me everything I needed to know about their priorities, their capacity for genuine change, and their willingness to take full responsibility for the damage their enabling behavior had caused to multiple people over many years. The blog that I had been maintaining as a private space for processing my experiences eventually came to its natural conclusion. After months of writing about family dysfunction, toxic enabling patterns, and the process of establishing healthy boundaries, I found that I had said everything I needed to say about those experiences. My final blog entry was deliberately brief and simple, containing just one line that summarized everything I had learned from my journey. Just because they lit the fire doesn't mean you have to stand in it. That single sentence encapsulated the most important lesson I had gained from years of dealing with Tyler's destructive behavior and my parents' enabling responses. I had finally understood that other people's choices to create chaos, drama, and destruction didn't obligate me to remain in harmful situations or sacrifice my own well-being to help them avoid the natural consequences of their actions. The fire that had consumed my family relationships hadn't been started by me, but I had been standing in the flames for far too long, trying to protect people who were actively feeding the destruction while expecting me to absorb the burns and damage on their behalf. After posting that final entry, I made the decision to step away from blogging entirely. The writing had served its purpose by helping me process complex emotions and gain clarity about my experiences, but I no longer needed that outlet for healing or self-reflection. I had moved beyond the point where my past experiences required active processing or ongoing analysis. My life in Copenhagen had become genuinely fulfilling in ways that had nothing to do with my family history or the toxic relationships I had left behind. I was building a career based on my own competence and professional contributions, forming friendships with people who valued mutual respect and healthy boundaries, and creating daily routines that brought me satisfaction and peace. The absence of family drama hadn't left a void in my life that needed to be filled. It had simply created space for healthier, more positive experiences and relationships that were based on genuine connection rather than guilt, obligation, and historical dysfunction. Justice, my rescue dog, had become an excellent companion who perfectly matched my need for loyal, uncomplicated relationship dynamics. We understood each other's boundaries, respected each other's space when needed, and provided mutual support without drama or manipulation. Our daily walks through Copenhagen's parks and neighborhoods had become one of my favorite parts of each day, offering quiet time for reflection and appreciation of the peaceful life I had built for myself in this new environment. As time passed, I occasionally received updates about Tyler's situation through indirect channels, but these pieces of information no longer had any emotional impact on me. I learned that he was serving his sentence in federal prison, that the additional criminal cases against him were proceeding through the legal system, and that he would likely face additional time for the various identity theft and fraud charges that were still being prosecuted. This information was simply factual data that didn't affect my daily life or emotional well-being in any meaningful way. Tyler's consequences were exactly what they should have been based on his choices and actions, and the legal system was handling his situation appropriately without any need for my involvement or concern. My parents, as far as I knew, were dealing with the financial and social consequences of their enabling behavior in whatever way they deemed appropriate. They had chosen to protect Tyler rather than listen to my warnings for years, and now they were living with the results of those choices without expecting me to help them manage or resolve the problems they had created. The cycle of crisis creation, family drama, and expectation that I would provide solutions had finally been broken. Not because anyone else had chosen to change their behavior, but because I had removed myself from the toxic dynamic entirely. Looking back on the entire experience from the perspective of my new life in Copenhagen, I felt neither regret nor resentment about the family relationships that had been lost. The people I had walked away from had never truly valued or respected me for who I was. They had only appreciated my willingness to absorb the consequences of other people's poor choices and provide solutions to problems I hadn't created. The relationships I was building in my new environment were fundamentally different because they were based on mutual care, shared interests, and genuine appreciation for each other as individuals rather than on guilt-based obligations and one-sided expectations for support and understanding. For the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing what healthy relationships actually felt like. Supportive when support was genuinely needed, respectful of boundaries and individual autonomy, and free from the exhausting dynamics of manipulation, enabling, and emotional manipulation that had characterized my family interactions for decades. The peace I had found wasn't temporary or fragile. It was the solid foundation for a life built on my own values, choices, and relationships with people who understood the difference between love and exploitation, between family loyalty and toxic enabling, and between helping someone in genuine need and being used by someone who refused to take responsibility for their own actions. Tyler had burned down our family, but I had chosen not to burn with it. Instead, I had walked away from the fire and built something entirely new and better in a place where the smoke couldn't follow me. The scars from that experience had healed into wisdom, and the strength I had gained from surviving those toxic dynamics had become the foundation for creating the peaceful, fulfilling life I was now living. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and others is to refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal means walking away from people you once cared about. Sometimes survival looks like silence, and sometimes healing requires complete separation from the sources of ongoing damage. In the end, Tyler's story became a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of never facing accountability for harmful actions, while my story became an example of how it's possible to break free from toxic family patterns and build a life based on healthier values and relationships. The brother who burned everything down had ultimately burned himself, and those who chose to stand with him in the flames had been consumed by their own poor choices. But for those of us who chose to walk away from the fire, there was the possibility of building something better from the ashes. Something that couldn't be destroyed by people who confused love with enabling and family loyalty with accepting unacceptable behavior. The end of my family relationships hadn't been a loss. It had been a liberation that made room for the authentic, healthy connections that would define the rest of my life.